Well, the people in UK are clearly unhappy with the EU. If they leave, they will take along with them the idea of a united Europe. Has it been as successful as we've been led to believe? Those are some of the questions that are coming up. We'll be analyzing the risk from that and other factors like the meteoric rise of Donald Trump in the United States. What does that really mean for India? I am now joined by KC Singh, former India ambassador to the UAE and Iran, and Dr. Sanjaya Baru, former media advisor to the Prime Minister. He's also a prolific writer, political commentator, and a policy analyst. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us here on The Big Picture. Let me take my first question to you, Ambassador Singh. You know, we purposely pegged this discussion as India in a broken world, really to underlie the tensions, that we are seeing around the world. Who knows, in a week's time, all the polls are suggesting that UK will indeed vote to break out of the European Union. Who could have contemplated that 5 years ago? Also, the meteoric rise of Donald Trump and the general anti-immigration rhetoric. There seems to be a lot of tension, a lot of flux. Do you think that this is going to be the new normal?
We don't know. You're right. There's a circling of wagons at moments of economic uncertainty, anxiety in the people. They will do this. They just start circling wagons. It's estimated that I think the question to be asked is, Britain haven't really calculated, were they to leave EU, what is going to be their relationship with EU? Because there's a European Economic Area in which two additional countries are there, Norway and Iceland. Then you have Switzerland with a separate treaty. Now, Britain have not negotiated that. They have a carve-out as it is for Schengen visa, home, law. So how do you decide to leave a thing without first deciding what is going to be your relationship? So there are all kinds of estimates saying that their GDP may come down by 1%, which is take a hit of $30 billion. There would be some concern to us. What happens to Land Rover? What happens to Tata investment, other investments? Do the duties will go up, at least for the British exports to EU? And then there is, of course, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Where does that come in? Where does Britain fit into that? So all over the world this is happening. You have the Trans-Pacific Partnership, you have Britain, US carving out areas for itself. So I think you're right, it's a universal sort of global move in which old structures where you talked of regional groups, free trade, global linkages, all that is being rolled back.
Right, absolutely, Ambassador KC Singh. Dr. Baru, let me take that to you now, sir, because, what is interesting, and I was speaking to a lot of analysts before we started this discussion, what they're saying is, if you juxtapose India vis-a-vis with what's happening in the United States. For instance, in India now, there is a broad consensus that even states are now beginning to understand and admit that we have to embrace capitalism, we have to embrace economic growth. That's the only way we can pull, so many people out of poverty, especially when 12 million people are joining the workforce every year. But look at what's happening now in the United States. A Time magazine survey actually said that only 19% people between the age group of 18 and 29 actually identified themselves as capitalists. So what's going on, Dr. Baru? This is the United States, the fulcrum, the bastion of free market thinking.
Well, not really. The United States has been a bastion of free market thinking in the last 40, 50 years. It's had a tradition of reciprocitarianism, of being insular, of a very government-led economy in the past. Economies that are strong believe in free markets. Economies that are weak believe in protectionism. Almost all those countries which have been strong economies in the post-war period were weak economies before that. Keynesianism was born in the United Kingdom. So whenever your economy is in trouble, people look to the government for help. People look to the government to come in and step in and take actions that protect them from job losses, from income losses. But when the going is good, everybody wants the government to get out of the way so that enterprise can move forward. So these are cycles that we have seen. There are long-term cycles, the enveloping countries historically over the last 200-300 years. I'm not as perturbed as is suggested by a lot of what has just been said about Brexit or about the crisis in the West. These economies are on a historic slowdown. For the last 200-300 years, the United States and European Union were on the rise. For the last 10-15 years, they've been slowing down, and my prognosis is they'll continue to slow down. And it's Asian economies, China, India, Korea, the ASEAN economies which have been rising. But these are all changes at the margin. It's the delta, it's at the margin that change is happening. The United States remains the world's biggest economy. In many ways, it's also the world's most powerful economy. But I think Mr. Trump is appealing to a sense of unease that is bound to be there in the United States, that is no longer the only power in the world. We are moving into a multipolar world. The Chinese have a bigger voice. India has a bigger voice. So therefore, Americans are feeling a little more insecure than they were in the past, and Mr. Trump is appealing to that insecurity.
Then, Dr. Baru, just to squeeze in one more question before I go back to Ambassador K.C. Singh, the fact that you also talked about and you alluded to the secular stagnation that many of the developed markets are facing right now. So in that sense, do you then fear that these feelings of protectionism, of economic insularity, if we were to put it like that, are here to stay at least for some time to come? Because clearly there is no turnaround. None of the IMF, World Bank reports suggest any sort of a dramatic turnaround, at least in the foreseeable future.
Well, first of all, those fears are there in all societies. Just as you said, some 19% don't consider themselves capitalists in the United States. I'm sure a much larger percentage would feel that way across Europe, India, and Japan. In every society, there are different schools of opinion. I think the overall direction of these countries is a slowdown. What Trump says in the election in order to harness this nervous voter to himself would be very different from what he does when he comes to power. Manmohan Singh used to always say very famously that it is not what politicians say when they are in the opposition that one must look at, but what politicians do when they are in government. Here we have seen this government, the BJP opposed the nuclear deal of Manmohan Singh, and now Mr. Modi has completed the nuclear deal. So what political parties say when they are in the opposition is often very different from what they do when they are in government.
Indeed, Dr. Baru. In fact, Trump has already backtracked on many of the other supposed promises that he had made in the past. Ambassador K.C. Singh, then, considering that there's so much of churn and flux around the world, Brexit is of course one of them, the rise of Donald Trump, is India's foreign policy attuned and does it is it taking into account, the broad global sort of upheaval that we are seeing?
We are doing it. The challenge, the two challenges that we are facing is, one is radical Islam to a West, which can affect markets, oil, resources coming to us. And the second one is, of course, rise of China. Now we are positioning ourselves. We have total convergence, large convergence with US interests to the East, but there's not the same convergence to the West. So you'll find this is an area of floating alliances, floating sort of agreements. I don't think to think that India has put all its eggs in the US basket is correct. But certainly Mr. Modi has moved a partnership short of an alliance with the US a notch or two notches closer. That is definitely there. And probably the times require it because we need technology, we need US support to enter technology controlling regimes. We need US in terms of military and other kinds of technologies, and to balance the rise of China. So at moments like that, we have to use all help, but we have to be careful that in doing that, we don't end up pushing Russia into the Chinese corner or other traditional Indian friends. So it's a balancing game which requires deft, extremely deft diplomacy, and can't be just sequential one hug and one kiss everywhere. You'll have to hold multiple hands and multiple tasking and the multiple diplomacy at the same time.
But well said, Ambassador. If I could just sort of persist with that point you were making, because one of our tools of foreign policy is of course been also sort of using our leverage as as a big market to actually lure and sort of stitch alliances with many countries. But at a time when, again, I come back to this point where where there's just general disillusionment with globalization in itself. So in that sense, do you think that is the right approach, sir?
You see, the concern is, I don't know whether this was discussed with the Americans or not, but if they're carving out a Trans-Pacific partnership, we are not in that. We've asked to join the Asia-Pacific Economic APEC. We are still not there. So the new carve-outs that US is creating, we'll have to make sure that we don't get caught between that and China. The Chinese will still penetrate the ASEAN market and other markets. Now, India may be just left in between, and I think that is because we don't have the export ability to have an export thrust with the products the way Chinese have. So we are still dabbling with infrastructure, trying to upgrade. We are doing catch-up, very, very, very rapidly doing catch-up. But how much of that catch-up you can do when there's a floating base? It's really very tricky times.
Right. Talking of exports, Dr. Baru, comment on that. I was actually, I witnessed this discussion between Martin Wolf on one hand and our chief economic advisor, Arvind Subramanian, on the other, really talking about whether this rapid service-led export model, which may have worked for some other countries, will work for India or not. That Arvind Subramanian said that India needs to follow an export-led model. Otherwise, we cannot grow. At least historically, all countries, especially in East Asia, have grown by focusing more on exports. But Martin Wolf, on the other hand, said that especially at a time, precisely for the reasons that I lined out, this anti-globalization mindset, and a lot of times, where countries like the US are getting wary of more trade with India, whether this export-led model will actually work or not. What are your views, sir?
Well, first of all, I would not use the term export-led growth for India. Export-led growth in the context of East Asian economies, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, even China for that matter, were a strategy where exports contributed to a substantial portion of their growth process. What we are achieving in India, or what we are seeking to achieve in India, is to increase our share of world trade. We have just about over 2% share of world trade, and we need to increase our share of world trade to around 5% at least in order to be able to sustain a balance of payments and pay for essential imports, energy imports, technology imports, etc. I would look at trade as a balancing element rather than as a leading sector for the Indian economy. But even to go from 2.5% share of world trade to 3 or 4% share of world trade is quite a difficult task, and therefore it requires a strategic engagement with countries which we see as our potential partners. Even with countries which may not be partners like China, we need to engage China in reversing this trade deficit. We have a huge $50 billion trade deficit with China. We've been pressing China to reduce the trade deficit. We need to push China into being more open. The Chinese are a very difficult market for a lot of Indian products, particularly food products and pharmaceuticals. We need to get the United States to be more open to us and pursue a strategic engagement with the United States, that where the US understands that India is a friend and needs help. After all, the US was more open to Chinese exports, was open to West European exports, and we're not asking for too much. It's not as if the US economy will go down under if India can export $100 billion more to the United States and the US shifts away from its dependence on China to a greater dependence on India. These are all political negotiations that we need to undertake. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is an American attempt at containing China's growth as a global trading superpower. But I don't see why they should be hurting us. We are not a global trading superpower, So I think we need to convince America that the TPP is not a good idea as far as India is concerned. And we need some way in which we can actually insulate ourselves from the impact of American, what I call geo-economic containment of China.
Well, Dr. Sanjaya Baru and Ambassador K.C. Singh, I wish I could have taken this conversation longer, but we have to end the segment now. Thank you so very much for joining us and giving us your perspective, India and a fractured world, right here on The Big Picture. Well, on to some disturbing news that's coming in from the UK. Labour Party MP Joe Cox has died in an attack apparently linked to